Chaos in the capital of Sri Lanka over the country's dire economic crisis as protesters storm the homes of the President and the Prime Minister. There have been months of protests which erupted today with people venting their fury on the streets. Extraordinary scenes as people take over the pool at the President's residence and march on official buildings, forcing their way in. And there are reports that the house of the Prime Minister has been set on fire. Well, the ongoing economic crisis in Sri Lanka has erupted today, with thousands of people storming the residence of the President in the capital, Colombo, and setting fire to the home of the Prime Minister. After months of protests, huge crowds, enraged by the authorities' handling of Sri Lanka's worst crisis in decades, overwhelmed the security forces. The Prime Minister has agreed to resign, and reports say the President will step down next week. Sri Lanka is suffering rampant inflation and is struggling to import food, fuel and medicine. Caroline Hawley reports.
The barricades were meant to keep the protesters back, but they were no barrier for the furious and desperate crowds, all suffering the effects of living in a nation in economic collapse. Police used water cannon and fired shots in the air, but the crowds were more determined. And they kept surging forward until eventually they converged on the presidential palace and took over the home and office of the man they want to force from power. He'd already escaped. In extraordinary scenes on a tumultuous day for Sri Lanka, the protesters then cooled off in the president's pool after all the privations of this country's economic crisis, clearly relishing this moment. You can just make out a four-poster bed as the crowds enjoyed the inside of his home too, and his bathroom. This was President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2020, campaigning during parliamentary elections. His family are accused by many of corruption and catastrophic economic mismanagement. There have been shortages of fuel as well as food and medicines after the government earlier this year ran out of foreign currency. Schools are closed, hospitals struggling. Protests have been going on for weeks, but today marks a dramatic escalation. We must chase them out, this man says. I spend 1 day a week working and 5 days standing in queues. Leave the country, this driver pleads. You can't govern this country properly. As the protests continue, Sri Lankans don't know now where their president even is, though one report said he's being protected by the island country's navy. It's been announced he'll step down by Wednesday. And this is said to be the Prime Minister's private residence. It was set on fire even though he'd earlier offered to resign. Sri Lanka is in an unprecedented crisis. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.